name is Jean-Marc Crickley. I'm head of the Global Risk and Resilience at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, GCSP. The GCSP is an international nonprofit foundation physically located in Geneva, Switzerland, comprised of 52 states in its foundation council, of which all the permanent member of the UN Security Council. The GCSP mission is to promote peace and international security, to prepare and transform individuals and organizations that can create a safer world. We are impartial, independent, and inclusive. The center fulfills its mandate through scholarship program for executive in transition. We can rely on a community of more than 8,200 individuals, alumni in more than 165 nations. When we started this webinar series 7 weeks ago, the coronavirus had infected about 1 million people in the world, and almost 48,000 people had passed away. Today, we have more than 4.35 million infections, so 4.5 times more than 7 weeks ago, and more than almost 300,000 people have passed away, which is 6 times more than 7 weeks ago. The topic of today is about a very important issue, which is the environment and the impact that the COVID-19 crisis will have on the environment. We have a very distinguished panel today to deal with the various issues relating to the environment. We'll start with my colleague, Ms. Anna Brach, head of human security at the GCSP. She will talk about the nexus between health and environment in the context of human security. Then we'll have Mr. Oli Brown. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House. He's also a senior advisor to TrustWorks Global, which engages public and private actors across sectors to resolve intractable conflict. He's also a trustee for Conflicts and Environment Observatory and an associate fellow at the GCSP. Then he will talk about the nexus between the environment and security. Then we'll have Mr. Vincenzo Paolo Iu. He is a senior legal advisor with Third World Network. He's a visiting research fellow also at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and an associate fellow also at the GCSP. He will talk about environment and the link with a developing world. Then we'll have Dr. Dhanasri Jayaram. She's assistant professor, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, Manipal Academy of Higher Education in Karnataka in India. And she's also an Earth System Governance Research Fellow. And she received the Swiss Government Excellence Scholarship 2018-2019 to pursue postdoctoral scholarship on climate security of the emerging economies. She will talk about the implication of the COVID-19 crisis for environment and security in South Asia, especially in India. And finally, and not least, we'll have Mr. Alexander Verburg. He's a founder of the Institute for Planetary Security, former policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and award fellow at Yale University, and also associate fellow at the GCSP. He will talk about the implication of the COVID-19 crisis to climate action. The current crisis is unique because no war, no recession, no previous pandemic has had such dramatic impact on emission of CO2 over the past century. If you look at this graph from NASA, this graph shows that the method to contain the spread of coronavirus in China have led to a 25% reduction of carbon emission in the country. Multiple sources indicate that we are now living through a rival drop in carbon drop. This chart shows that since the Spanish flu killed millions of individuals over 100 years ago, the global expansion of emissions of CO2 from the use of oil, gas, and coal has risen massively since then. During this period, CO2 went down. The biggest drop in carbon emission was during the global recession in the early 80s that followed the crisis of the 70s. And during this period of time, CO2 went down by around 1 billion tons. The current impact of the crisis is that can be seen on different indicators. The International Energy Agencies has noted that the world will use probably 6% less of energy this year, and a number of analyses show that emission of carbon will probably fall between 4 to 8%. That is between 2 to 3 billion tons for this year. That is between 6 and 10 times larger than during the last global recession. The full lockdown has also had impact on the consumption of global electricity that went down 20%, as well as coal that went down 8%, and road transportation has fell to up to 50% of the 2019 level. In Europe, the number of flights is down around 90%, whereas in the US, it has been more resilient with around half the number of planes taken off compared to last year. Globally, though, the demand for jet fuel is down 65% on a year-to-year in April. This is the largest relative reduction in air traffic ever. But there are some caveats to this positive development in terms of the impact on the environment. As the graph shows, there are differences, for instance, between Paris and New York in terms of the CO2 drop. Paris saw a 72% drop, whereas New York only 10%. This has to do with the fact that power plants and the electricity consumption pattern, especially in France, the electricity coming from nuclear energy has different impacts. So it means that even though such a large crisis could only have a drop of 10% on CO2 emission, that means that if you want to pursue the goals of reducing our CO2 emission, that will not be able to fix just by changing our behavior. We need to go beyond that. So if you want to achieve the 5% drop, I mean, if COVID-19 leads to a 5% drop in 2020, we would need to maintain that level up until 2050 to reach the goal set to maintain a warming below 1.5 degree. And this will require active climate policies. Also, 2020 was supposed to be the year of the superior for nature, with a number of conferences that deals with environment, especially the COP26 on climate change. This conference will be either postponed or go online, and therefore momentum could be lost. So the topic of this webinar is very much important because we are in the midst of a global health crisis, but the kind of challenges that this crisis raise are very similar to those with the environment. So let's explore that during this next hour. And to start talking about this issue, I invite my colleague Anna to give her the mic. Yeah, just unmute yourself, Anna.
Excuse me. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be able to give this small speech about environment and health and what COVID means for this. So I wanted to start with this picture, and my presentation is only presenting pictures. It's a sculpture by Isaac Cordal. It's a mini sculpture and called initially Electoral Process. But it was very quickly renamed as politicians discussing climate change, and I would actually argue it could be a little bit widened, broadened as a concept, and politicians discussing environmental challenge, because this is what we were dealing with up until we will hand it the COVID-19, and we really now have a problem because we have these underlying environmental challenges that did not disappear. And now on top of this, we have received the gift of COVID-19. And we now live in these unprecedented and very challenging times. And I wanted to look today at this nexus between environment and health and offer you a little bit of a human security perspective. something I work on at the GCSP quite extensively. So I will have three messages. Basically, the first one about the nexus itself, environment and health. Second one, what does COVID-19 mean for this nexus, and discussing a little bit the new normal. And lastly, I wanted to talk to you about what human security approach can offer for this discussion. So when we look at the nexus and beautiful earth in front of you, and how environment and health interact with each other, and this is an old story, it's not something new, and we are not discovering it. So I wanted to propose only four elements of this nexus here in this presentation. First of all is the pollution. And interestingly, it's not Beijing, it's not Delhi. This is actually Warsaw, from my home country. Pollution kills 9 million people every year, according to the Lancet journal. And this is really, like, when you compare with other reasons for deaths, it's really impressive. Second element of this nexus is the environmental degradation, and it includes the land degradation, water degradation, biodiversity loss, food production, and this could be a separate conference, and there are many of those right now. Fourth element, I would say it's a movement of people. So people move because of different reasons, of course, and it's an internal and an international movement of people, migration, which can be caused by and is very often caused by environmental factors such as natural or man-made disasters, and maybe the slow onset environmental processes like deforestation, like desertification as well, and these cause both physical and mental health issues. And I think the second one, the mental issues, we actually don't talk about them enough, and they are very, very important in this discussion. And last but not least, it's the movement of species. That's, let's say, migration of species. So on one hand, with the impact of climate change, you have different animals migrating to more comfortable, let's say, habitat. But at the same time, there is this process of people and animals living closer together, which in turn may provoke something that's called zoonotic diseases. So these are these diseases where pathogens can come from animals to human, and it is believed that COVID is precisely an example of such transmission. In this case, we have something that's called One Health approach, where professionals are thinking about, holistically about these both species, like animals and people, and how to address this challenge. So how this nexus is affected by COVID-19, and this is my second point. And I really like this slide, because this is really precisely what we are talking about here. Did we understand? Are we actually getting it? Are we, because we can see already these positive effects of the slowdown of economy. So what Jean-Marc just mentioned about the decrease in energy consumption, about the decrease of CO2 emissions, and we had some other reports talking about the decrease of deaths caused by air pollution, because the air pollution precisely went down, and the other one by precisely the International Economic Agency, that's talking about the decrease of demand and consumption of energy. So both these can be seen as positive signs, but the question is whether these trends are going to stick. Are we going to continue in this direction, or are we going to go back to this business as usual, as in the title of this webinar? So we can see at the same time littering of disposable gloves and masks, and everybody, or a lot of people and policymakers, talking about going back to business as usual as soon as possible. So So the question is, have we learned? Did we get it? At the same time, the resources that need to be allocated to address various challenges, it's not only environment and health, we are dealing with many other issues. For the time being, the resources at hand are mostly put in the COVID-19 response, and there is a risk that not enough will be invested into the more sustainable economy and different business as usual. So the question remains, what will be the new normal? And as in addressing the environmental challenges in times before COVID-19, we were expecting and really waiting for some bold decisions by the policymakers, be it in the area of biodiversity, in climate change, etc., etc. And these decisions were not taken. And now on top of this, we are getting the COVID-19. So it becomes problematic now because of this resource allocation, and it could be at the expense of environmental action. And at the same time, we know that the possible pandemic, future pandemic, can be prevented only if we deal with these environmental challenges. So this new normal should then really include the environment, because without this, we are going to be really in deep problems. And these policies, these new policies, need to be devised on all the levels, starting with the local level, but also at the global level. So we need to kind of get it right. And my last slide and my last point here is about the human security and what human security as a concept can offer to thinking about these issues. So what I want to talk about is more on the solution side and not all these gray space threats that are coming at individuals, because in human security we're talking about protecting the individuals. But I wanted to talk about two issues that are building blocks of human security. So the first one is the protection. So protection of individuals by the government, international organizations, international community. So at the time being, the COVID-19 protective policies are working, but in my opinion, they are really short term. And in order for them to work in the future and kind of preserve the future, they need to include environments. And this kind of holistic approach would make sense in the long term, and will make it much more strategic in terms of devising these new policies. And the second building block of human security is the concept of empowerment, of capacity building empowerment of individuals. So of course, I'm talking. It's a very global view. I'm not going into different regions and how they deal with this. But in general, I would say that COVID-19 increased awareness of the health and environment link. And there is an opportunity here to empower individuals and tap into this wisdom of, for example, indigenous people, rural communities, people who do urban gardens, people who work on circular economy, people who work on new technologies, those that we haven't really heard of yet, and to have this different discussion, a new discussion on alternative economic growth, moving away from this traditional approach, of GDP growth only. And to conclude, I just want to say that humanity up till now has not been very good at prevention, at long-term planning. And I think that COVID-19, even though it's really, really dire situation for, globally, it is a very challenging time. But at the same time, you have this opening to invent new business as usual when it's over, because it will be over. And we would not like to miss this opportunity to focus on long-term and prevention strategy. And I would really like to leave you with this, with a food for thought a little bit. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anna. So you set the stage by highlighting the connection between environment and global health. You mentioned zoonotic diseases, and we are actually going through that problem right now. And basically, you raise the question of what will be the new normal. And the new normal could be business as usual, or are we learning anything from that? And you ended up by putting emphasis on two aspects: protection and empowerment of individual to actually build a better future. So this is a really good observation. I would like to remind our viewers that you have the possibility to ask your question to the speaker. For that, you can use the Q&A tab on Zoom, and in the end, we will select some of your questions, and my colleague Ashley will actually select this question. The next speaker and experimentation, Oli Brown.
Very good, thank you. I'm a real pleasure to be with you all today. I wanted to sort of follow on from what Anna was talking about, to talk about what COVID-19 might mean for environmental security. And I guess it's a real I told you so moment where for years the environmental security movement has been jumping up and down, often outside the room, saying, look, you really need to think about environmental security, you need to think about environmental integrity, and if you don't, it has very real implications for people around the world. And so, you know, mostly we've been ignored, and now COVID-19 has demonstrated tremendously powerfully that environmental health in one place has security impacts elsewhere. But just jumping up and down and saying, I told you so, doesn't make you very popular. So it doesn't really help much. But I see out of the COVID-19 epidemic, I guess, three reasons for optimism, if we can try and find some silver linings in this cloud. I mean, the first is that it shows that individual action has enormous consequences. Indeed, it's only through the individual action that we're taking that we have any chance of addressing COVID-19 without a vaccine, without a treatment. So individual action is where it happens. If ever anybody thought that what I do doesn't matter, surely that argument has changed now. Secondly, I think this has to change the way that people, businesses, governments think about risk, how they plan for it, how they prepare for it, how they invest in it. And thirdly, it shows us the importance, as Anna was saying, of prevention, of resilience, and critically of early action. It was only those countries that took early action in terms of lockdowns that avoided the worst impacts. And so if you have early action, it's just demonstrated so powerfully that moving earlier is much more effective than moving later. So those, I think, are some of the things we have to take out of this and take forward in the kind of environmental security movement. But I guess there are some real risks here as well, for security in general and environmental security in particular. I think that over the short term, the scope for accidental or engineered misunderstandings among the great powers as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic is really quite frightening. Also for non-state actors, for would-be terrorists, for countries that are you know, are willing to go towards this. This is a very powerful example of the potential impact of biological weapons. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was quite a lot more thought going into both the creation and ways to reduce the impact of biological weapons. You know, in terms of sort of copycat events and so on. But over the long term, I guess, time will tell what kind of political echoes this whole event has. We can already see some things that are happening in terms of the great power relationships between US and China, the position of individual governments, ethnic relationships at a country level. But these things play out over decades. And I think this is really important for both environmental protection and for security. If we look back, you know, back to the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, that had political ramifications way beyond what I think any of us ever thought about at first in the middle of that crisis. I think we can draw a fairly direct line from the financial crisis in 2007 to Brexit in 2016 to Trump to a whole range of other things. And I guess this leads me on to my next point, which is the impact of COVID-19 on global cooperation. As Anna was talking about, global cooperation for environmental protection, but also for security collaboration. Already before COVID-19, we've seen this unraveling of the system of multilateralism, of interdependence, of working together to address shared challenges. This is a web of interdependence we've spent 75 years developing. When you think about what came out of the Second World War, it was the UN, it was the Bretton Woods institutions, it was the welfare state, it was all of these different things that came out of that, as well as decolonization, and an entirely new world developed out of it. And for the last 10, 15 years even, we've seen that web of collaboration slowly starting to sort of disentangle. And so I really worry that this is going to accelerate that. I think so many of us who live in these sort of internationalist world of conferences and discussions of these issues live in these bubbles of assumed values, that we assume that everybody agrees with us that working together to fix shared challenges is the way we have to work. And that's unfortunately not the case. And I think one of the long-term political ramifications of the COVID-19 epidemic might be to accelerate that. Somehow, I don't understand this, but somehow being a globalist has become an insult, with the implication that that's something counter to a national agenda. And if COVID does anything to us, it should show us that you have to think globally if you want to look after your own people. But again, we can see how messages can be twisted and how people can take different things from this. So I really worry about what this means for the multilateral system. I think it's been very difficult for the multilateral system to confront this, to address it, to show how it's relevant to it, because this has primarily been about national responses. So I think over the long term, I think what we should all think about is how can we redouble our efforts to make sure that global cooperation, global collaboration continues, and that we don't lose this sort of multilateralist approach of working together to confront shared challenges as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic. So I think that's not a particularly positive note to end on, but I think it's one of the big challenges we have ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. I mean, you raise a lot of different points. So that you mentioned that there are some points that leads to optimism. The fact that individuals can have a huge impact, that those countries reacted early could actually deal better with this crisis. But you also highlighted that basically there are risks that are stemming from this crisis, not the least revival of great power rivalry. The fact that this pandemic could give ideas to non-state actors, and that leads to the whole issue of weaponization of biology. And a very important that you made at the end is, and this is the point that has been mentioned in all the webinars so far, this is the future of multilateralism. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have a special issue, an episode on this issue, but this is very important. The kind of problem environment that we are dealing with are global by nature. The problem is that there is a backlash in terms of globalization, and great powers tend to unravel the multilateral system that was developed after the Second World War. So very important point and food for thought. The next speaker is Vicente. Vicente, the mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Marc, and thank you, Anna and Ollie, for those remarks as well. I think they tie in very well with what I'm about to present. Let me share my screen here with you, because I did prepare a PowerPoint, which I thought might be useful in terms of making sure that when we do look at the pandemic and we look at the responses that we will have as a global community to it, we approach it from a systemic way, because we, as I think, as Anna and Ollie have pointed out, there are so many interlinkages with all of them. Let me start by some examples of what we are seeing in terms of the environmental impact of COVID-19 in some of the countries in the developing world. I think as Anna and Jean-Marc have pointed out, we have improved air quality. There are pictures and stories about for the first time from New Delhi, you can actually see the Himalayas already after 40 years. You've got smog going down in Beijing and all that kind of thing. But as Jean-Marc was pointing out, it's actually very temporary. It's only for this period because nobody's traveling. Factories are shut down in many countries, and that comes at a big human cost as well, because many poor people are being hit by the fact that you're not actually doing any economic activity. What we're also seeing in many developing countries, especially those where you have municipal systems where waste management is not very well done, either because they're open landfills or they just do open burning. There are increasing difficulties in how you do manage the plastic waste. I've seen stories, for example, in some countries where they have pointed out that you're now seeing in many beaches and parks or walking trails discarded single-use surgical masks, single-use gloves, things like those. And I think that is going to be, as the pandemic goes on, that is going to be a bigger part in terms of how one looks at it from a developing country perspective. For many developing countries where you have a lot of reliance, for example, on ecotourism, or where you have significant stretches of their territory which are being protected as natural parks, we are seeing increases in poaching, increases in deforestation, largely because either tourism receipts have gone down, and therefore you don't have enough, the government doesn't have enough money anymore to pay for the rangers and all that would protect the wild animals from poaching, or prevent illegal loggers from going in. And that is now happening, for example, in Indonesia, in the Amazon, in DRC. One of those things that we often do not see because it's a bit far also is that while the pandemic and the lockdown that has resulted in small-scale fishers and commercial fishers to remain in port have allowed fish stocks to happen, again, like many of these other the positive environmental impacts that we have seen during the pandemic, it has come at a big human loss as well, because income for many of these small-scale fishers, for example, have gone down. So what I think, as a couple of, as both Anna and Oli pointed out, what we have seen is that the health crisis has become an economic and financial crisis, especially in developing countries where you already have a lot of structural challenges that are in place already, which have kept many developing countries in a state of poverty for a large part of their population. So you have impacts of climate change, you have impacts of environmental crisis, you have, and all of these have resulted in a situation where, as with climate change, as with biodiversity loss, the developing countries are the ones that are being hit hardest economically. And what we have seen now is that there are increases in poverty and inequality both within countries, and we are seeing that even here in Europe and in the United States, but also among countries where you see the fact that countries that have well-built infrastructure, that have the ability to provide for fiscal stimulus, are still in a relatively better position than countries that do not have these things. So I think Anna was pointing us towards the idea that when we look at the post-pandemic response, and we look at all of the linkages that we have altogether, the post-pandemic response has to be systemic and it has to be structural. So it means it has to be transformative, it's not incremental, and what we're looking for is something that is a multi-dimensional approach where resilience is being built to address all of these things together, not only the pandemic, but also climate change, poverty, environmental crisis, and all of these things. And that means, I think I'm drawing a bit here from what Oli was saying, that means I think we have to really think about what are the regulatory frameworks that we are putting in place, whether it's on trade, whether it's on investment or on finance, what kind of new incentives or bans or prohibitions do we need to put in place to shift away from the pre-pandemic business as usual to a post-pandemic new normal. And that might include, for example, looking at how we reshape macroeconomic policy, how we reshape social security policies, how we reshape the fiscal stimulus that should go towards creating the economies and rebuilding the economies so that you are able to gear them towards better resilience, better sustainability, and better development equity. A key part of that systemic response that I think many of us are now thinking about, and which I think is quite clear, is that you do have to have this strengthened multilateralism. And we know that this kind of approach is difficult now with the kind of approaches that we see some of the major powers taking place. But that is the essence, that is the essential thing that really needs to happen: international cooperation and coordination. And when you therefore you do this pandemic response measures for the short term, it has to be with the idea of looking at, okay, how do we make sure that these short-term responses build us towards a longer-term response that is much more systemic, much more structural, and much more integrated in a way, where you are able to address all of these things that I have listed down in this slide. Just to close, I think it would be useful for us to take a read at what more than 10 years ago, 11 years ago, actually, at the start of another crisis, when the United Nations had this World Conference on the Global Financial Crisis in 2008, the UN General Assembly at that time, the late Father Miguel de Escoto of Nicaragua, said something that was quite important for us to read. He was saying that when we take decisions, it must be that affect us collectively. It must be for the common good. That we have to acknowledge that things as they were in the past have been the result of lifestyles, of consumptions, of relationships, both with our economies and with nature, that have in effect brought us beyond the carrying capacity of the planet, and created a profound social imbalance. And so what we need to do is not do incremental changes, not try to bring us back to the pre-pandemic normal, but replace that with a new normal that is built on solidarity, that involves change in a systemic way, so that when we are able to do, as he was putting here, a qualitative leap forward towards peace and well-being. So maybe let me end there, Jean-Marc, and I'd be very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. Again, you reiterated the fact that there is a need. It's a good time to do a huge rethink about what will come next. And again, the type of problem that you highlighted are global, interconnecting, and that require a systemic response with resilience built in. I think resilience is a very important point that we see not just in the environment, but across all dimensions that have an effect, an impact on security. The third episode was about the use of technology during this crisis and how it could also be misused. And a very important fact, observation was also that resilience must be built in the way we are using a technological system. So the new normal should actually look at the way short-term responses are being framed in order to have long-term benefits. And again, this is probably one of the most important challenges that policymakers will have during this century. The next speaker, Dhanashree.
Yeah. Thank you for having me here. And the topic that I would be talking about is actually on South Asia. So after hearing about a lot of issues about global scenarios and about from the global north, from the global south, and also about multilateralism and a whole lot of issues, I think it's also important to look at specific regions and what their specific requirements are at this time of crisis. And I will be talking about South Asia with some more emphasis on India. It is a it is a huge crisis in this region. Although the numbers in terms of infected cases and deaths may be low in many of these countries, but we are looking at the numbers going up and spiraling, maybe out of control, in especially countries like India. Now, the issues that are at hand, of course, are multiple. I don't think it is just restricted to COVID-19 pandemic or environmental issues. It is also linked to socioeconomic issues. It is also linked to health issues. So there are a whole lot of factors that are at stake here. And I think in that respect, majority of the South Asian countries are vulnerable to the cascading impacts of this COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the crisis that is linked to the lockdown measures and other kinds of measures that have been put in place by governments of the region. I mean, maybe I would like to start with the issue of disasters itself. And I think this is probably the largest, this is probably the most vulnerable part of the world in terms of cyclones, flooding, drought. So it's not just slow onset disasters, there's rapid onset disasters and a whole lot of other disasters that we are facing. So we have
I think we lost Dhanashree.
Extreme heat conditions. So the individual. So what? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, can
you
hear
me? You broke for a few seconds. Can you just repeat what you said in the last 30 seconds?
Yeah, yeah, I just changed the connection. So just in case it works, if it works better. Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, sorry for that. Okay. As I said, the extreme heat conditions would be probably one of the biggest challenges that the disaster management authorities and governments are going to face over here, because the Indian Meteorological Department, for instance, has already declared that this summer is going to be warmer than usual. And that means that, everybody has to deal with not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the extreme heat conditions. And especially at a time when everybody's following lockdown measures and not everybody has access to air conditioning, for instance, everybody's cramped up in small spaces where extreme heat is something that everybody is vulnerable to. And concerns regarding extreme heat is just one aspect. Now, we are also now coming close to the onset of the southwest monsoon. Now, as you know, the flooding disasters that we have seen in the past few years have led to immense amount of losses, immense amount of deaths. Now, if you look at examples like Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which has been susceptible to cyclones, to flooding, drought, deforestation, landslides, and this is probably the world's largest relief refugee camp where the Rohingyas are housed. And what does this indicate? Now, amidst pandemic and amidst this kind of disaster, the kind of pressure that is going to be put on government agencies and disaster management authorities will be immense. And that is why you can already see India's National Disaster Management Authority is already talking about, okay, we are going to look at multiple hazards at the same time now. So you need integrated risk assessment, you need integrated risk management that needs to be looked at, especially at a time when the pandemic is kind of unleashing havoc all across this region. The second point that I wanted to raise was about food insecurity. And I think this is probably another major issue that we will see coming up, not just in India, but also in other countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, also Afghanistan, which, by the way, is still undergoing this spiraling effects of conflict, hasn't really come out of the conflict trap. And what does this mean? Like COVID-19 is just one aspect. You have drought, you have food insecurity, which comes from that. Now, those kind of issues are something that again leads to this kind of conflict trap and that kind of cycle, which countries may not be able to come out of that easily. So yes, in terms of food insecurity, there is a possibility of food riots, for instance, if the agricultural activities are hampered to such an extent that there is not enough food supplies. That is just one part, but livelihood insecurity associated with the agrarian crisis that we are in the middle of. So the agrarian crisis is not just related to COVID-19. South Asia has been facing this crisis for a long period of time. And because of various reasons, including recurring drought and recurring floodings, and because of which we also have had a lot of migration, for instance, from rural to urban areas. And now you see the reverse migration happening from urban areas to rural areas because people are out of jobs. Unemployment has become huge. Because of the lockdown measures, daily wages have gone out of jobs, and construction workers, for instance, also have gone out of jobs. And that is why there is this huge insecurity that is looming large in this region. Because a large section of the population is still employed by the informal economy. And so we are talking about informal sectors which are in much grave danger as compared to the other sectors. So the disruptions that are caused by this kind of changes in the supply chains and the manufacturing sector, the MSMEs, the micro, mini, small enterprises, which also, by the way, dominate sectors like the renewable energy sector, they all have come to a halt right now. So much more action needs to be done in order to put some stimulus into these sectors. So that's the second point about food insecurity, which is also linked to, like I said, livelihood insecurity. So there is a question of equity and justice here, which is also, like I said, linked to human security and environmental change. And I feel, especially for countries of the global south, the so-called global south, and countries of South Asia, this is a huge issue. That's one major area. The other point is about, of course, how we are going to come out of this crisis and how we are going to deal with this emergency. And I think this is probably the question that everybody is asking, like, will the recovery, the so-called recovery, I mean, when and if that happens, because we are still facing that dilemma of trying to choose between lives and economy and trying to have different kinds of approaches to deal with the pandemic. That's just one part. But how do you deal with the pandemic in terms of the recovery? Now, many people say that, yes, I mean, that's one of the things that people are rejoicing over, that, oh, the Himalayas are now visible almost 200 to 300 kilometers away, which hasn't happened in the past 30 years or so. The air has become cleaner, the water has become clearer. So the Ganga and the Yamuna, these rivers, which are usually considered highly polluted, have suddenly become clearer because of the lockdown measures. But is this something that is sustainable in the long run? I'm not really sure about that. Now, that's the problem. So when we had this relief package that was announced a couple of days ago by the Indian government, it's huge, by the way. It's 10% of India's GDP, the whole relief package. Now, that is huge in comparison to many other countries. How much of it is going to be channeled towards renewable energy or other kinds of climate-friendly measures or climate adaptation or building resilience is something huge question mark over there. We don't know how things are going to pan out. And although, yeah, of course, another good news, by the way, is that, yeah, in the past 1 year, India's emissions have dropped by 1%. So, yeah, I mean, probably this is a good signal, but that is because we've had an economic slowdown. Yes, there is renewable energy expansion that has happened as well. But at the same time, it is during this lockdown period that most of the emissions came down. So is this what we are looking at, or I mean, at what cost is something we will keep asking ourselves? Do we need this kind of a change in the systems, or do we actually bring in more of structural reforms that Vincente also talked about? I think that is what is very central to the question of our recovery from this situation. And if you look at countries like Maldives, I think it's a very crucial period for countries like Maldives, because tourism, which is the biggest sector for revenue generation for countries like Maldives and Bhutan also, if tourism sector, of course, in terms of numbers, Maldives is not as much affected. Yeah, not that many people have been tested positive, but the tourism sector has completely come to a halt. And what does that mean? There is not enough revenue generation, and of course, tourism sector is also the biggest employer in this country. Now, where will the money come from, like resources come from for climate adaptation or other kinds of resilience building activities that these countries have planned in the past few years? So there is this huge amount of uncertainty, not just at the national level, but also the global at the global level, the world economy, and how these things would pan out for countries in South Asia. So, I mean, one of the things that I was reading in Pakistan, for instance, they are now re-employing or employing those unemployed laborers who lost their jobs because of the lockdown measures. Now they are kind of growing trees. I mean, so they are the jungle warriors or something. So I mean, this could be just a stopgap measure. This is just a stopgap measure, but in terms of the relief packages, which all the governments have announced, by the way, but we have to see how things will be. Yes, coal consumption has gone down, oil consumption has gone down, electricity consumption has gone down in the region in the past 1 month or so. But this is a trend that may not continue. I already see a coal mine, for instance, for being given clearance by the Environment Ministry in India, which may be completely flouting environmental regulations. We don't know, but a lot of things are being cleared during this time. Big projects, which may not be really in consonance with the environmental objectives that we have in place. So yes, the problems are galore, and the uncertainties associated with problems is even bigger. So I think we have to wait and see as to how and where our focus is going to be. The entire region's focus is going to be in the future when it comes to the green growth or low carbon growth and everything that we are talking about. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dhanashree. Well, you painted, I have to say, quite a bleak picture of the situation in South Asia. You did a really good job at showing how climate condition, the weather, food, insecurity are completely enmeshed, and with this crisis, everything is interlinked, and the needs again to have a rethink about the recovery. And the issue that you mentioned was that there is a high risk that recovery money will go for quick fixes, not thinking about the long term. And I think that's not just for South Asian countries, but probably it's for most countries in the world. And so again, the common thread for so far among all the speaker is this need for a global governance system that think in a holistic way. The problem is, how do you implement such a system? Well, to finish this round of presentation, Alexander, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Climate change, climate action came already several times. It was mentioned by other people. And of course, the first thing that everybody notices is that the front pages are nowadays no longer about Greta, but they are about COVID, and also that that there's a lot of positive news in the sense that CO2 emissions are going down, and so is air pollution, and we see that wildlife is returning to their habitats, and they're even returning to our habitats. So you see goats and deer walking in the streets of our cities. So you could say this pandemic has made the world in a kind of real-time laboratory for sustainability. America, for instance, is on track this year to produce for the first time more electricity by renewables than that they will produce by coal. I'm not sure if that's the federal government's policy, but this is very positive news, I would say, from an environmental point of view. But before you start to celebrate, I want to share 3 sobering thoughts. First of all, let's not make the mistake of thinking that the lockdown is the same as a form of climate action. Climate action asks for long-term policy, it asks for structural change. And if we all stay at home and we watch Netflix for a couple of weeks or a couple of months maybe, you can beat a virus, but you cannot beat climate change. Those same greenhouse gases that are the problem, they're out there in the atmosphere, and they will stay there for a very, very long time. Secondly, although emissions are down, they're not so far down as we had hoped for. I've read several numbers. You mentioned 4 to 8%. I saw 5.5 somewhere, but let's say it's roughly about 5-6% that we are down. That means that is still below the 7.5% reduction in emissions that we need to have every year this decade if we want to stay be low, and heating compared to pre-industrial times of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So if we would compare what we're doing now to climate action measures, we would need to do more of this, and that every year, 10 times. So of course the lockdown is not climate action, luckily, because otherwise we would never get there, I think, if we see what's happening now. But you may lose hope if you see that we created now the economic crisis of the century, and that still emissions are like something like 95% of what they used to be. So the main thing you could learn from that is that personal change doesn't do as much good as we had hoped. So we need really structural change, like, you know, ditching fossil fuels and replace them by renewables, that kind of thing. We all love to look at flying. There's a lot of attention for flying now. The fossil fuel industry loves to talk about flying because they might scare everybody that, you know, if you take climate action, you cannot fly to your holiday anymore. And on the other side of the spectrum, the climate activists like to talk about flying because it's one of those very few things where actually you can do something yourself in changing emissions. The other thing you could think of is eating less meat, and there it's more or less stops because there's not so much more that you can do. So we stop flying, and that's only a small percentage of global emissions. I suppose cargo flights are still mainly taking place. Transport is only 20% of all the global emissions, all forms of transport together. So heating and electricity is already something like 40%. The big construction projects are going on, the heavy industry are going on. They might all be a little bit affected, but not too much. So the third of my sobering thoughts, in the Anthropocene, we will increasingly see that extreme events will impact each other. I've spoken in the past a lot about climate change and security. Ollie already referred to that. But let me give two examples. If we stay in South Asia, recently in Northeast India, the extreme weather related to climate change forced farmers to harvest earlier than they normally would have liked to do. So they were stuck with that harvest because they couldn't bring it to the market. Storage is the alternative, but storage is difficult in the strange climatic and weather conditions that we nowadays have. There's also more pests than there were in the past. Same for the fishermen. They caught their fish, but because of the COVID measures, they couldn't get the wood to dry the fish. So the fish was also rotten, couldn't also be brought to the market. One other region, to give an example, if you look at the hurricane season in the Caribbean and the southeast of the US, that will start in only a few weeks. Now imagine, well, first of all, the Gulf of Mexico, the water in the Gulf of Mexico is warmer than ever before. So that energy will somehow find its way in the destructiveness, the forcefulness of the hurricanes. Now think about the kind of situation that we've seen with Katrina. We all remember, you know, the scene in that stadium where all these people were packed together, refugees without anything. This was the only safe place they had. Add COVID-19 to that mix. Where's the hand washing? Where's the social distancing? Where's the aid? In a time, by the way, when all the aid money is already spent on all kinds of other projects. So it will be, we're compounding these risks on top of each other. And that's typically something that we will see more of in the Anthropocene. So the key question is, of course, and some of you have referred to that already, is how are we going to build back better? How can we do a green recovery and transition away from fossil fuels? Individual action can only do so much, not too much, we have seen. Structural change is needed. And the enormous amount of money that are now made available are impressive, but you can only spend them once. So you have to spend them in the right way. So something like, let's say, renewable energy, that is both clean, it's good for climate, but it also creates more jobs than in the traditional fossil fuel industry. Think about restoration of ecosystems or spend the money on research for clean technologies. If you now look at the US, and if you look at Europe, in the US, for instance, you see that there's now an amount of $25 billion given to bail out the airline industry without any green conditions attached. That is basically, we're just going back to the old system. I think there's more positive news from Europe. There's now 17 countries that have asked the EU to focus on green recovery, include climate change in the measures, basically mix the Green New Deal with the post-COVID rebuilding measures. And the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, is speaking along the same lines. So to sum up, the lessons learned, also having listened to everybody else, the key message, I think, is governance matters. Preparation matters. Science matters. That is true for pandemic, but that's also true for climate action. The pandemic was predicted, although we didn't know when, we didn't know how badly it would be. But if you compare that to the predictions of climate change, those are extremely precise. We just know which actions will cause how much warming, and we have a pretty good idea how damaging all of that will be. And if we want to keep this planet a livable place for our children and our grandchildren, we have to learn from this pandemic that we can globally radically change everything as we know it for the common good. We're doing it right now. But we have also learned that our leaders in the different systems that we have in the planet all tend to go for the short-term measures and not for the long-term measures, and that they all have a tendency to act too late. And I think with climate change, that is exactly what's going on right now. Sorry. As the last thing, I said earlier that as an individual, there's basically two things you can do. You can fly less and you can eat less meat. Those are the two ways that you can have impact. I think there's a last and a third thing that you can do, and that is vote for leaders that have a long-term vision for the future, that believe in resilience, that believe in a sustainable rebuilding and restructuring of our societies when the pandemic is over. Thank you.
What you mentioned is, again, I was expecting a positive outlook in this panel, but looks like you all share some kind of pessimism. And what you highlighted, well, the lockdown is not climate change. That at the individual level, we might do adapt our behavior, but we won't have that much of an impact. Again, we need a complete rethink of what is happening in the environment. And so you also mentioned that the interconnection again of these different problems, and that the situation could worsen because the pool of money is not unlimited. And as we are going through pandemic, as we are going through environmental hazards, these funds are melting, and we need also to rethink about resource allocation. So I was hoping for some optimism. Maybe people during the Q&A, the questions will get there. So I give the floor now to Ashley, who will run the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. And to my speakers, I will address each question to you directly. If you hear a question that was useful, something that you wanted to address, please feel free to do so. Anna, my first question is to you. How can we reframe the environment security nexus so that it resonates with decision makers and policy makers who may prioritize hard security? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to go against a little bit the title of my my position at the GCSP, which is Head of Human Security, because what we can see now that framing the environment and security nexus in only terms of human security is actually doesn't work. And we to mobilize people, policymakers, leaders to act. We actually need to move the conversation more towards the national state security, where decision makers will see the stake at of the environment and security for the countries. So yeah, this would be my, without forgetting that the human security, of course, like we have to have both. And I always say that it's a work on the continuum. On the continuum, it's not either or. But in terms of making the decision makers, policy makers understand and really take the decisions, yeah, I think this is it. And there is another point that I was just thinking about while I was listening to Alexander. It's, because sometimes you almost need a Titanic kind of event in order for us to act. And I was in a way hoping that COVID-19 would be something like that. And for the time being, we are really, as I said in my presentation, it's really short-sighted for the time being. And we're just patching whatever we can because this is what needs to be done. And the electoral cycle is only 5 years, so you have to address these issues. And without addressing, as Alexander and everybody else was saying here, we actually need to have the systemic and approach and holistic approach if we want to. So I'm digressing, but I really wanted to put this point forward because I really don't want another Titanic, to make us act. I would like now to be the time to reinvent this new normal. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. The next question is directed to Ollie. How are we able to speed up the process as multilateral systems are increasingly tedious and bureaucratic? Trust has been lost in the system as it is. So how do we regain trust in that process, and how can that process be moved along in a quicker pace to see action?
That's such an excellent question. And I think this is one of the key questions for the multilateral system. I mean, the multilateral system has to earn the trust, it has to show that it can develop, that it can respond to the crisis that's in front of it. And so we have to find a way in the multilateral system of being more responsive, being more effective. The challenge is that all too often, and I'm not trying to shift blame here, but too often national systems blame the multilateral system for things they can't do themselves. And so it becomes a convenient scapegoat for where national systems realize that they don't have the power, or they need somebody else to blame. So it's one of those things where the multilateral system is this amorphous mass that can conveniently be labeled anything you like. And in this particular case, what we're seeing is that national systems are being more responsive. They are where people are closing borders, governments are closing borders. All of these interventions are being taken at a kind of national level, and multilateral systems are getting sidelined. So I think what we have to do, I think, firstly, is to, coming back to Alexander's point, is to vote for leaders who have a long-term vision, of where we as a kind of collective global community work together to confront shared challenges. And that involves everybody taking responsibility for the mechanisms we have for confronting those challenges. So we need leaders who are going to harness multilateral cooperation, not blame it. We need multilateral cooperation that is as effective and as fast as it possibly can be, and it has to be reformed. And the things often that have held back reform of multilateral systems is individual national interests, where individual countries have their own particular pet organizations that they support, that they don't want to see changes in. They have their own positions to perpetuate and so on. So really, I think it comes back to, as Alexander was saying, the third issue: vote for leaders who have a long-term vision, and a long-term vision should include effective multilateral action. Thank you.
Thanks, Ollie. The next question is to Vincent. Can you please, a question was asked on how can this crisis somehow be used to solve the huge existing single-use plastic problem? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think no, that's a very good question, because we are going to see more and more of that, and we have had all of these initiatives, to ban single-use plastics. For example, the EU has had a directive, and then you have it in including in many developing countries where cities and municipalities have in fact banned single-use plastic. And I think the question there, and this actually goes to I think must have been Jean-Marc or Alexander who pointed it out. I mean, how do you create incentives for manufacturers, for the private sector, for the public sector that can produce these things in a way where we don't have to use plastic? And for that, I really don't know. But the obvious solution there is for a lot more thinking needs to go into shaping the appropriate regulatory response for that. If the increase in the use of single-use medical plastics, which become eventually medical waste as a response to the COVID-19, is that it becomes you have a lot more of these going into the public waste system, then perhaps the more obvious response is looking at, okay, what's the regulatory response to that? How do you invest money into your public waste management system in order to be able to sort these things out properly, and then go from there. The not correct response is to say, well, as a result of COVID-19, let's everybody start using single-use plastic again. And that's going back to the pre-pandemic normal. And we must not go down that road. We have to go forward and think more strategically and more systemically about how to do things better. I wanted to also point out something, and this is something that you had asked Ollie about. And I was looking at the question and answer in the chat box. These examples of international cooperation. And I think a key part to that is you do have examples where international cooperation has succeeded. Think of the ozone layer. In 1985, the Vienna Convention on the ozone layer was adopted, entered into force in 1988. It took the global community about 25, 30 years. But now, more or less, the ozone layer, according to the scientists in the southern hemisphere, is more or less fixed. It's still there, but much, much, much thinner now. And I think that is a prime example of what international cooperation can achieve. And what it took was you had governments, you had stakeholders, including the private sector, you had technology made available, the finance made available, you had appropriate regulatory frameworks put in place at the national level, you had monitoring systems put in place at the international level, and all of these things worked. And I think that could be a model, not only for how we deal with the post-pandemic situation, but also how we deal, for example, with climate change. And the Paris Agreement is still there. We are still trying to develop it a bit further, but we have to give it some time as well to see how we play these things out. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great example and a great framework to share. Dhanashree, my question to you is, how can the government of India or in the region of South Asia, how to keep up the morale of the population despite the challenges facing the region? Are there preventive measures put in place to help ease the pressure? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, all across Asia, the morale when it comes to the economy is pretty low as of now, because already the forecasts say that there's going to be not much of a GDP growth rate across Asia, South Asia. In fact, India and Bangladesh were still growing at a decent rate in the past few months, and we've had an economic slowdown in India. And now with COVID-19 pandemic, of course, the things are looking much more bleak. And like, I think I've already, yesterday in the class that I took for the GCSP program as well, I think I mentioned this, that it's important to remember that the prioritization sometimes doesn't work in favor of more and more environmental action, as some would imagine, especially in contexts like South Asia, because the priority here is to make sure that everyone has access to food, everyone has access to water, and that's at also another level, it is also about trying to make sure that livelihoods are secured. Because right now, the relief packages, like I mentioned, it's mostly to make sure that some of these industries which are heavily hit by the pandemic and the lockdown measures are able to, come back on their feet and somehow survive, because there are immense amount of job losses that have happened. And so the relief packages are not really about that, are not really about environmental action. It's or trying to make sure that the recovery is sort of more green or clean. It's more about trying to make sure that that everyone is, in terms of human security or food security or water security, those things are secured at the ground level. And I also wanted to mention that it's also important that, when you talk about the international scenario, and I think Bangladesh, Maldives, these countries were very much looking forward to what would be decided, for instance, at the climate change conference that was set to happen this year, because these countries are heavily dependent on financial and technological resources that come from other countries. Now, with the disruption in the supply chains, in the kind of cooperation that is happening in terms of financial or aid or recovery programs, there's going to be a lag. I'm not saying it's going to be completely stopped, but even in terms of the renewable energy expansion, I feel the money that is going to come into these sectors will be much slower. And therefore, the morale in terms of just, poverty is still a big issue across this region. So I don't think this is something that is, just emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was already there. And the situation has sort of worsened now. You must have seen enough and enough pictures of migrant laborers who are suffering across this region. And the migrant laborers, once they're out of work and they go back to the rural areas, how do they have access to any jobs? The agricultural sector is already hit by pandemic. I saw that there's a question about the food crops, So of course, we've had a bumper harvest, but unfortunately the pandemic hit and then everything just came to a halt, and the distribution lines, the supply chains, everything has been hit. And now what happens is, okay, we wait for the southwest monsoon, and then we know how the flooding is going to affect the agricultural sector even more. So there's a lot of things that may happen in the future. So we are trying to look at different scenarios in which different sectors are going to be hit, and they're all interlinked with each other at the end of the day. So keeping the morale can be very difficult in such a situation. And that's why, I feel there is also a lot of scope for something like regional cooperation. And I think that is important at this level. It's not just about international cooperation, multilateralism. It is also about trying to bring those countries together at the regional level, which is also kind of slow because of the political tensions that exist between the countries. So let's also, bring in the geopolitical problems that are having an influence on how countries cooperate on issues related to the pandemic or climate change or any of these issues. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is to Alexander. May you please share, if you can, some examples of international bodies who are coordinating efforts to deal with climate change during this pandemic? Do you have examples that you could share that you've noticed? Thank you.
I don't follow that too much in details. I'm not the one to ask that question to, but of course, first and foremost, every day on CNN or wherever you look is the World Health Organization as a multilateral organization that's completely on top of this, coming consistently with the best scientific advice that they can give. And when I said, listen to the scientists and listen to the experts, well, there you got a good bunch of people together that have worked for decades on these issues and that come with the right advice. And the response from governments has been very different. You see some governments that, especially in Asia, that really picked up quickly and took the right measures. You saw other governments being a bit slower, and you see a few governments led by populistic leaders that don't want to listen to science at all and just ignore it completely. And yeah, they score quite high on those indexes where you don't want to score high, like the numbers of that. I think the UN is, of course, the first one you could think of. The EU is yeah, if you could call that a multilateral body or a country, we're always somewhere in between. Of course, I should say it's multilateral. But the EU is already working on a Green New Deal. I'm quite confident that a lot of the Green New Deal will be merged into the efforts to take the right measures after COVID. And I'm quite sure other regional organizations will also work together on these issues. If you come back to those risks where all of these organizations are working on, you know, whether it's on migration or refugees, etc., I think all of them will struggle with the fact that already all those UN agencies and other international organizations, their agenda was already full. They already had to deal with a lot of governments not believing very much in a multilateral approach anymore. We have this other pandemic in the world, which is called, you know, nationalism and simplicity and basically bad governance. And that goes hand in hand with the real pandemic. So the challenges that they were already facing, which is, you know, the effects of climate change, of ecosystem loss, of biodiversity loss, the resource scarcity, and basically you can tick off all the 17 of the SDGs as the kind of challenges they already have. Now you add to that this COVID-19 with everything that's related to it, and that really makes it worse. Look, for instance, at how these multilateral organizations have to deal with a situation that you have now in West Africa. If you look at countries like Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, you see that there was already a whole mix of problems. There was already climate change. It goes hand in hand with security problems. They are both reinforcing each other. There's already food and water scarcity, etc. And now the borders are closed. The nomadic herdsmen can no longer cross the borders. You cannot, the crops that have been produced cannot be brought to the market in the next country. So suddenly borders are being drawn up within countries and between countries. And in this already horrible mix of challenges, you just, instead of solving problems, we are basically creating extra problems to solve the problem of COVID. So I'm not against it. I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but it just increases the challenges for these multilateral organizations. And as a last thought, whatever way we're going to govern in this century, the solutions will be found on solidarity, on cooperation, on understanding, and together sharing the best knowledge and resources and people that we have to solve these challenges. And multilateralism, in whatever improved form, because of course a lot of things have to be improved, but multilateralism is the way to go. And it is certainly not nationalism and ignoring science and just a lot of boasting and screaming and asking for attention in the media instead of taking really care of your people.
Right. Thank you very much for your answer. I have one to end on a positive note. I have one question to all of you. We have less than 6 minutes left, so I would like you to answer very briefly. But what is the glimmer of hope? What is one factor Ragnar mentioned that makes you feel confident that something good could be could develop or could happen? Anna, very quickly, and then each of you.
And for me, there is this beautiful saying in phrase in French, but I don't know how to beautifully translate it into English. La prise de conscience. So really the increase of consciousness with people, and I know that it sounds very, you know, new agey, but I think that people are waking up slowly but surely, and I know we don't have much time, because, for example, there was one question on very quickly, there was one question on private sector, and the way I see it, for example, private sector, okay, everybody's turning to private sector, oh, please save us and, you know, give us money and we'll do it. But on the other hand, there's another story with the private sector. I would recommend the Netflix TV show Rotten, where actually private sector should in certain moments step aside and actually let people, local people, address their challenges. So I think there is a certain consciousness that is growing, and I think that this is my at least take on the positive future, a more positive future. Thanks.
So this crisis contributes to raising awareness among people. That's good. Ollie, very short.
Very brief. I mean, I already talked about this thing about, you know, this brings us back to the importance of individual action and the importance of prevention and resilience, and this idea that environmental management isn't just about birds and butterflies, it's also about humans. If I was going to add one more thing as a positive thing, I think this is going to lead to a drastic drop in illegal wildlife trade, would be my guess. I think it's going to become politically, socially unacceptable for a government to be sort of having a blind eye to continued illegal wildlife trade, given some of the zoonotic impacts that has. So that might be one thing that comes out of this. Back to you.
Thanks. Thank you. Dhanashree?
Not able to unmute it. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute it for, yeah. Positive response. I mean, yeah, I think in my presentation, I think I was very bleak and very pessimistic, but I would definitely say that, yes, as far as consciousness is concerned, I see there is a lot of community level action happening in South Asia, and I think that is great. And I feel very confident about those kind of organizations becoming more and more active and having that space to be more active, which is more important in countries like India, because you know, there's always that restriction on how much private players can actually play a role, or individual actors can play a role in how things go in the future. But I see that most of even during the lockdown, which was quite strict compared to most other countries, India's lockdown of 21 days was so strict, nobody could even step out of their houses. Now, even during that time, it was these community level organizations that played a big role in making sure that everyone at least had access to food and water. I mean, that's like the basic thing that you should have access to. And even in terms of climate, I feel that there is a lot of consciousness and awareness, which I hope will translate into action. I already see a lot of people coming up with policy recommendations and, you know, telling the government to make sure that you solarize, for instance, all the rural healthcare centers, because there is no electricity in every part of this country. Still, there are many households without electricity. Now, how do you make sure that you have decentralized systems in place? And I think the government is realizing that probably this is the best way forward to make sure that at least everybody has access to electricity. So I think certain things I feel we are going in the right direction as well. So maybe this pandemic has taught us a few lessons that we should be prepared for in the future.
Thanks. Vincente?
Thank you. If there's one thing that gives me hope in this pandemic, it's because we are all human beings. And, and the reason why I'm saying that is because a lot of the things that we have seen that have gone wrong in this world, which have created the systemic challenges that we have pointed out during this webinar, have all been because of human decisions. And human decisions reflected in appropriate policy can make changes, including individual human decisions that Ollie was pointing out, and also the systemic government-driven policy decisions that Alexander and Dhanashree were pointing out. So if there's one thing that is hopeful about this whole situation, it's because we are all human beings and we are all in this together. Thanks.
Thank you, Vincente. Alexander?
What gives me hope most of all is if I look at the medical workers, people working in medical facilities, so anything from the doctor to the cleaners, people that do keep showing up for work, often being badly paid and not rewarded for basically risking their lives to save the lives of others. And that gives a lot of hope. If you look at the individual level, anybody doing shopping for the old lady that is living next door that you're normally not in touch with, but you're helping out now, I have so much respect for that. And as a last one, I I really have a lot of respect for the governments that managed to get through this crisis by convincing the people of the country to do the right policy instead of enforcing it with all kinds of, police measures, etc., that are sometimes quite draconian. By just communicating the right way, convincing people to behave as well, and that then the overwhelming majority of the population is actually convinced and following it, that gives me hope for solving all the other crises that we are going to face this century. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So very happy that we finish on a positive note. And if I could summarize, maybe, is that this crisis put humans in the center, and it gives agency to human beings. So I think it's a good insights and recommendation to take for future development after this crisis. I really thank you for all your very valuable insights. Next week, the topic will actually continue on along these issues. Will be about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on global inequalities and the future of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. The webinar will be Wednesday, 20th of May at 2:30 p.m. CET. So until then, you can watch all our previous episodes, including that one on our YouTube channel, as well as different social media channel. And don't forget to sign up for next week's episode. And until then, stay safe. Bye-bye.